Okay, hello and welcome. We'll give a few moments just for people to join. Thanks very much for joining this session. It's exciting. It's the first of a new set of type of talks, our Ignite talk. And the purpose of Ignite is to ignite passion, interest. So I'm hoping that we're able to do that for you today. I'm only able to see, we just had a last minute platform panic. So if I look stressed or any of our speakers do, it's because of that. We just managed to get online and it looks like we have everybody. Just a quick sound check, Karl, Mike and Alex.
Hello.
Hello, everybody.
Brilliant.
I can hear you,
Good
Karl.
afternoon, everyone.
Fantastic. So we didn't get to have our little huddle, and given just the very last minute panic, I wondered if one of you wants to volunteer to go first.
Yeah, I can do that. I mean,
I was going to say
it's
I would
going to
have
get worse,
nominated
isn't it?
anyway, Mike. So, so that's kind of good. You stepped up. Okay, so the first of our Ignite talks, Mike. Why don't you introduce yourself and a little about what you're going to be talking about today?
Okay, so today, I mean, I like learning stuff and I like being useful. So my talk today is about learning stuff, using mapping to help that, and then using mapping's idea of user needs to make sure what I'm learning, has a use somewhere for someone.
I can see Wardley maps in the background. Did you just put those up for today, or is this evidence?
No, this is my life.
Fantastic, fantastic. I thought it was just a prop. Well, no, sounds amazing. So for me, it's interesting. My context for mapping personally is largely my work. So you heard Simon talking earlier, we used to work together at Ubuntu. I've stayed in that world of cloud, and I'm largely helping people to do what we call digital transformation. So for me, it's actually about understanding the businesses behind all of the technology. So it's very much around sense making in order to see where difficulty is. And so I'm curious to see your learning mechanisms as well. Go ahead, Mike.
I'm keeping it weird. Right, let me just share my screen.
That's the idea. Thank you.
Okay, can you see that? Brilliant. Okay, let's go. So welcome to this talk, Stealing Ideas for a Book Using Wardley Mapping, which is part of the Weird Mapping stream. I'm Mike Habar. This talk is about how I learned to make sense of an expert using mapping and how mapping might provide a structure and challenge to successfully acquiring and sharing knowledge. And of course, this is all me looking back, trying to get some retrospective coherence from what I've done. So there are other ways to look at this, but I think there may be useful ideas here about how I learned things and how a map for learning can influence a visual map for a book, or in my case, cartoon comics. So I was first introduced to Dr. Caitlin Walker's work through the Open University and her TED Talk. For some reason, almost everyone else on the course thought Caitlin's work was a bit weird. Initially, Caitlin was working with some of the worst kids in London, and she got them to successfully sort their lives out. She was asking them some questions, getting them to do some stuff, and the kids came to understand what was happening and what they wanted to happen and sorted themselves out. Caitlin's work stands on the shoulders of David Grove. Well, from this work, Caitlin developed something called systemic modeling, which is a way of working with teams of all types, aligning their ideal interactions with the often problematic behaviors that are happening, right now. And I thought learning this from Caitlin would be straightforward. Caitlin was keen to share, and I wanted to learn, so, let's go. So at this point, I'd like to ask you to take a moment to think, is there an expert that you're trying to learn from? How's that going? Maybe after listening to his talk, we can compare notes. So, do you have a favorite expert you're learning from? Okay, this is a 10-minute talk. I'll not leave you long. So Caitlin invented systemic modeling, and I'm trying to learn what Caitlin is doing, as a facilitator. So Caitlin invented something, Genesis, and custom on my map is someone has worked this out, but I need to work bits of this out too. I need to learn this. And I'm fudging product on my map to be, I can just learn how to do this and buy help. It's just a thing. I can maybe get certified too. So I'm learning new behaviors and actions to do what Caitlin does. Caitlin was showing and telling stories based on theory and principles. And there were no trade secrets here or magic of, I just knew what to do. However, I have dyslexia. Amongst other things, I have a very poor working memory, and I learn stuff by connecting it to other stuff in my brain. So I can learn principles and work out what to do, but I can't memorize lots of bits of unconnected stuff. But I've learned hard stuff before, so how hard can this be? Well, after some days of learning, I was struggling to make sense of what I was seeing before it flew past and I forgot it. And mapping helped me make sense of and help me retain what I was seeing. Mapping provided a structure for my brain for adding new stuff and helping to direct questions to find out information that was currently missing from what was said, but I knew it was there because it had a location on the map. So systemic modeling is something Caitlin had invented. I was figuring out how to learn it, and mapping, with a few other ideas, was helping. And Caitlin helped a lot here as well, answering my questions and remembering stories with the right information in. So to help learn, I borrowed the idea of two different types of knowledge from Cynefin: the knowledge of how to act in new situations based on principles and context, and what you'd like to have happen next. You always need to work out what to do within compromises and constraints. And then there's the knowing 100 types of things type of knowledge, where you need to select the right thing at the right time and have the skills to do whatever it is. Well, these types of knowledge aren't directly on the map, but the components and skills required for each one can be placed. And this was the first way I could make sense of what I was learning and remember it. The second way I was learning to understand what I was learning was part of three what I called value chains that came together to meet the user need of group facilitation. The first was learn to work out what Caitlin might do in a new situation. There could be more than one potential right answer, but there were definitely wrong ones. The second one was learning the skills to do what Caitlin does. And the third was learning how to practice to get feedback and improve. So focusing on the second component, learning the skills to do what Caitlin does, we know that mapping steers us towards agreeing on names for things in value chains. And for this middle chain on the visual, I split what I was hearing, seeing, into three categories. One above the line and three below the line here. Above the line, we might be seeing and hearing evidence of what is said and done. Below the line comes from stories. Might be telling us how they decided to do a particular thing rather than a different thing. Or they might be talking about how they made sense of what they noticed and the context they're in, with the constraints and contract. Or the expert might be telling stories and providing theory about what they noticed. And there's already a name for these things, so I just stole the idea here. I was creating a contextual OODA for an expert. I could see and hear the act, and I was creating a list of the things to notice, the information needed to orient, stories with information about how to decide what to do, and those examples of act that I'd seen and heard. So I'm suggesting OODA can describe the things an expert does before they act. We can fill in the details to learn from them. So I could ask questions of the bits that were missing from the stories. The map told me they needed to be there, because experts know their subject too well to be able to teach. You kind of have to stop them and say, when you just did that precise thing, what was it that you saw? And what other options to act might there have been? So in real time, I was able to ask myself, how does what I'm seeing go on a map? And ask questions where the map has space for answers. And my lack of short-term memory forced me to find somewhere permanent for these things, or else I forgot them. So the idea for a book part of this talk comes from me sharing drawings and cartoons of this with the people I was learning with, and their idea of collecting these into a book of some sort. And I'm going to suggest a book ought to have a Wardley mapping style user need. We can all think of books and courses that teach or explain valuable skills, like Learning X, but Learning X is not a user need. Sadly, learning Wardley mapping is not a user need, but the visualizations can be combined with other valuable skills to meet a user need in the words that users would use. And I might be thinking of user needs like how to learn from experts, might be a useful thing, or how to be less of a dick more of the time, might be a user need, combining a few of the things that I've learned and mapped. So maybe you're learning from experts like Simon Wardley, maybe Dave Snowden, who's coming later. Or maybe you'd like to do press interviews like the RMT's Mick Lynch. How does he keep composed and respond so well? And the knowledge might be mappable. So a map worked for structuring what Caitlin knew. And with the right constraints, it might work for others. So to recap, if you're learning from the type of expert who works out what to do in new situations, you might be able to use mapping to help learn and share the expertise you've learned. But of course, winning your first ever mixed martial art fight isn't a book that exists. There's a limit to what you can write and learn and what needs to be practiced and have the response drilled into you. So being an expert is not something you can learn exclusively from a book, even if all the parts of the OODA are there in black and white. But as a framework for learning and questioning an expert about what they're doing, this has worked for me. So as a group, we'll be job shadowing Caitlin before and after each session, and Caitlin would say, I'll tell you exactly what just happened. And you ask me questions to find out how I knew what I do, how I knew what to do. And mapping can help with those questions, and for me, help remember the answers. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of stuff didn't make it into this talk. Bits you might have noticed that are obviously missing, like 3 more talks worth. And there are or will be some proper maps of this on my website soon. I'm writing comic books about the things on the maps, about user needs that use bits of systemic modeling and other visualization coaching skills. On my website, Substack, and I tweet stuff. And this is a real work in progress. I'd love people to work with on this. So thanks to Simon, Caitlin, Dave, John, and everyone else who shares their ideas and kindly guides people who try and butcher them together. So let's keep mapping weird. And that's me done.
I'm not sure it is weird enough because it's so applicable to everybody, Mike. Talking just done. Well, let's just roll back a bit, right? So Simon mentioned it in his keynote, really thinking about the early mappers. I was one of those people, I turned up, I think, to 3 map camps in a row and didn't really know what I was doing. All I knew was there's good stuff here and there's some smart people. It took a long while to find that context, think about how I could use this tool for myself, actually find a place. And by the time I did, it was a real experience because I was very much often learning from things I heard 2 or 3 years ago in these sessions. So to me, the whole aspect of mapping first what you don't know before you venture into it, then of course mapping yourself as a learner. So I'm really interested in this angle. That's actually my first question. Have you mapped yourself in terms of dyslexia to see what challenges or what that advantages that gives you compared to other people?
I mean, I haven't. That feels an extra level of meta that I've not yet gone to.
Yeah,
but this is not the first time I've done this. With dyslexia, I did a degree in maths and physics, and I had to figure out a way to learn that with dyslexia. I just didn't realize what I was doing.
By the way, what was that? How did you do that?
That's another 10-minute talk at least. But this was the first time I'd learned something, but also was working with someone who was also interested in how I was learning and what I was doing. So I was able to have the conversation of, Caitlin, I'm not learning this. I need to find a way to learn from you. And now, having done that, it's possible this is useful for other people. As you say, stuff on the map, it goes there. Go and ask a question.
in the planning for MapCamp and thinking about asking questions such as who is MapCamp for, who are we serving, you've answered a number of questions within that. Like, we needed Mike in those meetings, because this is really, yeah, I'd love to just take time to think about this. Now, look, we've got two other lightning talks. I think that we can come back to this. We have a little bit of sort of buffer time for Q&A at the end as well, although we've sort of built in 5 minutes for each person. I'd love to return to your talk and to encourage anyone, especially anybody who is not actively mapping or doesn't have a clear sort of understanding, just to throw in any questions, you know, the stupider the better, that you might have around learning and about finding a purpose on mapping. I think there's a much bigger piece here that can actually be helpful to the community. But thanks so much, Mike.
Cool.
Brilliant. So Alex and Karl, who'd like to go next?
I don't mind going next.
Brilliant. Go ahead, Karl. Why don't you introduce yourself, the general topic?
Sure. So my name's Karl Scotland. So I'm a lean and agile coach and consultant. I work with Tech Systems Global Services, leading their agile practice. So I mostly use Wardley mapping and Kinevin, and I'm going to talk about kind of a blend of those ideas in this talk, in the work I do with organizations and teams that I work with. So let me
SenseMapping.
Yeah, SenseMapping. So yeah, I'll describe what I mean by that in the talk, I guess. I
was going to say, because I thought that, and I thought, well, isn't it all SenseMapping, or trying? Yeah,
so it's I guess what I'm trying to do is take the idea of sense making, and the way Dave Snowden talks about sense making, and apply it to Wardley mapping, because I think there's a slight difference there.
No, thank you. Let's hear it. Thank you.
So let me share my screen. So I'm trying to do this. Is the first time I'm doing a presentation in Miro. So let's see how this works. So hopefully that's coming through.
Yeah, looks good.
Cool. So I've talked about me, so I can move on to that. So yeah, this talk came, and the background to this talk is when Simon and Dave did their kind of Wardley mapping Kinevin masterclass. Way back in December 2018. I looked up the date, and I can't believe how long ago it was now. So this is, I grabbed this photo from Kamar, who was there, that had a much better angle than I did, much better photos. So the two of them spent 2 days talking about their ideas, and then overlaying them on top of each other, synthesis, blending them. And one of the ideas that came out of that, and from chatting with Liz Keogh, who was there, was the idea of the differentiation between sense making and categorization. So the way Dave Snowden talks about the difference between the two, sense making is where the data precedes the framework. Categorization is the framework precedes the data. So when we work with Kinevin as a sense making tool, we're putting the data onto the Kinevin before we start drawing the lines. And the idea, the aha moment, and the thing we went and played around with is, well, what would happen if you took that idea and applied it to a Wardley map, on the basis that let's say a Wardley map is more of a categorization exercise. And I kind of want to be clear, I'm not saying one of these others is better than the other. They're two different ways of looking at this. So I thought it'd be useful, maybe let's just kind of get into what I mean by sense making, and do a little kind of mini 4 points, show you how 4 points works. So we've got a bunch of things on the left here, which are things we want to make sense of and map out. They could be anything. And we start off by looking down in the bottom right-hand corner, and we say, which of these is an example where the right answer is most self-evident? And we grab one of those. Obviously, we have a conversation about it, have a bit of a debate, pick one, move it down here. Then we say, which one is an example where experts or due process should be able to produce the right answer, up in the top right. And we kind of have a discussion and move one of these up here. Then we say, well, which one is a best example where, with the benefit of hindsight, we would know all about what we would need to do, but we can't know that in advance. And we have a conversation, and let's pick this one, put it up here. And then lastly, down in the bottom left, which of these is an example of the most chaotic or random or unexpected event that happens? And we pick one of these and move it down here. And then we just pick another one and we're going to move it and position it relative to these 4 in the corners. So this is called 4 points contextualization, or 4 corners. And I kind of think of it, imagine there's a bit of an elastic or a force field drawing it to the corners. Where does it settle? So if we kind of think it's most like this one in the corner here, but there's a bit drawing it down here. I'm gonna put that one there, and then I pick another one, and now I'm positioning this one relative to the 4 corners, and this one already placed. So I'm gonna put this one up here, and basically rinse and repeat, and you end up with this this kind of map here. So we've now positioned everything on here. So we've now got the data, and now I'm going to draw the Cynefin framework around it, and we decide where we're going to split these things. So I'm going to pull that one there, and this one down here, and this one. So this one I'm not sure about. I kind of think it's a bit on the boundary. So I could decide, actually, I think there's 2 bits to this. And I'm gonna, split out into 2, and one sits down here, and this is HA, this is HB. You get them. So we're putting the data onto the Cynefin model, and then we draw the framework around it to make sense of it. Now, if we look at a Wardley map, let's go back into presentation mode. We've already got the lines on here. We've already got the 4 sections, particularly on the evolution axis. So the thinking here is that this is a bit like categorization, because the framework's already there and we're putting data on it. What would it look like if we put the data on there before the framework, and how would we do that? So essentially, we're doing a similar thing here. I'm going to take one of these, but first I'm going to talk about which of these is the most ambiguous. So I've taken my evolution scale and talked about ambiguity. I'm going to pick one of these and say this one's the most ambiguous, the one I kind of I know least about. And this one here, I'm going to move over here, and this is the one I know most about. So it's the least ambiguous, or the most clear. And then again, I can start moving these on here. I'm just going to put them in relative to each other. Like this. I'll not move them muscly. This won't take too long. So we just kind of got a general order of least ambiguous, most ambiguous to least ambiguous. And now I'm going to say, of these, which of the most visual to the customer or the user? What's the user need? We have that conversation. And I think this is the one that's the most visual, or it impacts the customer most directly. And now, which of these is the least visual? I'm going to move this one down. So we're kind of keeping them in the same place where they are from an ambiguity perspective. And I'm now talking about the visibility of the closeness to the customer, and I can start moving them up and down again, etc. And then I can start making the connections. So I can say, well, actually, yeah, this one B needs M needs G needs J. So we start forming out the value map, the value chain, the last thing we do. And then what I can do is, if I wanted to, is I can now draw my lines again, and I can say, actually, these are the things that I think are in Genesis. These are things that are in the next stage. And where am I going to draw this line? Here, maybe. So I'm drawing the lines on afterwards. So as an example of this, just to kind of show you what it looks like in real life. Again, this is, I use this with organizations where I'm using agenda shift as an approach. So the numbers on here refer to agenda shift survey prompts. The content doesn't really matter, but you can see that we've taken a load of ideas and put them onto a Wardley map style organization, showed how the different needs between each other, talked about ambiguity, visibility to the customer, and essentially done all the things we need to do to have a conversation around where should we take action, where should we focus on, which are the high leverage points. You can see there's this one, 4.2 regular cadence down here. It's got 4 arrows going into it. The other thing you might notice is there's a loop here, so I don't worry so much about the things naturally flowing down. Some things, the arrows go up. The main thing is you've used the technique and the exercise to get people to have a conversation, using the basic premises of ambiguity and visibility to help teams to map things out. There's a couple of blog posts if you want to look more on this. So one by myself, one by Mike Burrows, who developed Agenda Shift. Thank you very much. That's what I wanted to say.
Wow, Karl. First question, and this might be a little bit dumb. In the first two stages, are we to assume that all the elements per letter mean the same thing in the second, right? So you're effectively taking it through two passes.
So yeah, when I do this with a workshop, yes, we do the two passes. You can do it in isolation. The reason I kind of showed the Cynefin style was to try and show an example of what we mean by sense making. You could take a bunch of components or needs and just bung them straight onto the Wardley map and talk about ambiguity first, talk about customer needs second, then make the connections and kind of draw in the evolutionary stages last.
Fantastic. Any questions from the rest of the panel before I run on? Mike, Alex.
Are there any situations where alarm bells might ring when you start mapping this out? Like if very ambiguous things would be like near the top of the Wardley style map, do you need to have some kind of firm foundations of known stuff to stand on?
I guess that's one of the things that comes out of the conversation when teams are doing this is if you see that, you might ask a question about it. I don't think I've seen that very much. It tends to be more about just helping people see the relationships between things. So we sometimes talk about this as options relationship mapping, compared to Cynefin as option approach mapping. So we've got all these things we could work on and do. What Cynefin tells us is what approach we should take in terms of getting experts, running experiments. What Wardley mapping is telling us, what are the various relationships these things on our landscape, and therefore which things should we work on. So if you saw something that was really hard to customers, really ambiguous, that might be a signal that maybe we should look at doing something to make this less ambiguous. This is, that's a concern or that's a risk.
Thank you.
Have you found any particular level of scale or depth, should we say, of a problem that this is most impactful within to sort of have this almost dual sense process? And that could be a stage in your mapping process as well, or stage, I suppose, of certainty that you have of the problem that you're trying to solve.
So I'm normally doing this within a workshop, normally with development teams, and without kind of going too far into the agenda shift process, you get the teams first to just think about what would it be like when teams are working at their best. So actually use some of Caitlin Walker's stuff that Mike was talking about, and use some clean language to them to help them get towards what outcomes they would like to achieve. So actually what's on those hexes and the things that we map out are outcomes that we've kind of got to through a clean language type approach of thinking towards outcomes. What would we like to have happen? And then we're using Wardley mapping and Cynefin to start explore and map out the different options that we have, how we're going to approach those, what the relationships then with the relationships between them, effectively to start us thinking around what's our strategy as a team to start making changes and improving our ways of working.
Really interesting. I suppose this is a question that I suppose applies to Mike as well. Maybe I should have left it for the last session, but it's about comparison with other formal enablement. And again, really what I'm looking at is anything that we can perhaps accelerate, or areas where we can gain more clarity. And this is more a question around the types of enablement. So if you think for example, of somebody just using Wardley mapping or just doing facilitation using Cynefin, are there specific areas where you think, oh no, it really accelerates this area, or it gives you much more clarity at an earlier stage, for example? I'm just curious about any comparisons you've made with I suppose, vanilla facilitation for either method.
I guess for me, they're different ways of getting a shared visual understanding and having a conversation. So we talk about a Wardley map, and I think the same with Connecticut. It's not about whether it's right or wrong. It's about that conversation that you have to come up with a kind of common and a shared understanding in order to create some sort of alignment on what we need to do next. Yeah, and there are lots of other different ways of doing that. So, you know, user story mapping is another similar sort of technique we might throw in there, where you're kind of looking at the kind of a workflow or a number of different stages things you might want to do, and how you're going to break that down and decide how to take a thin slice. We can do that with a transformation as well as with a product.
That's really thought-provoking. And on just what you say, one thing I took away was, wow, you can use images of the things, like what Mike was doing, rather than words. And for me, he's super visual, actually just coming up with a whole load of icons that just visualize the thing. I think makes a map more consumable, or just more understandable.
Yeah.
Mike?
I think, and that visual thing allows you to ask the question, you know, what needs to be here but isn't here yet for this to make sense?
Yes.
And
yeah. So that
visual
comes
things.
up a lot when, yes. Yeah. You see, actually, we don't have a relationship between these things currently, but maybe there should be. Or this thing's sitting on its own and there's nothing linking into it. What's going on there?
Well, look, I'm conscious of the time, and I want to move on to Alex, who is talking about something, I suppose, super interesting, and it relates to what Mike was talking about. I had a kind of question around it, which was, mapping the self in your own journey. Goes right back to the thing I was talking about at the beginning, where I knew I had a powerful tool and I didn't know where to actually deploy it in terms of my career, my personal life. So I'm interested to hear on what you're going to tell us on mapping oneself, the self journey. If you want to introduce yourself.
So thanks everyone for joining. Good afternoon. My name's Alex Hudson. I'm a consultant CTO, so I'm technical like a lot of other people here. But the topic of my talk is about that use of Wardley mapping to think about yourself. And I really like the way Mike was talking earlier about kind of following questions up with answers and trying to visualize that. And it's exactly that use of the tool. But instead of trying to map the landscape that we see and sort of develop situational awareness, it's about turning it inward and thinking about what we would consider ourselves to look like as a map, and rather than situational awareness, generate self-awareness. So that's the high-level thesis of the idea.
Excellent, really interesting.
So I'll share my screen, and hopefully this one will come up. So yeah, a little bit more about me. I've been mapping since about 2015. I remember going on my first workshop, I think in June 2015, with a bunch of other CTOs. And like a lot of people, we started our journeys thinking about the kind of commercial applications of mapping. So if we're thinking about the environment in which we want to bring a product forth, or an industry that we want to understand better, that use of mapping was very much where I started. And my particular industry is healthcare. It's been very useful in that environment. I found, obviously, like a lot of other people, once you start using the mapping skill set and trying to look at different situations and landscapes and things, you see that there are a number of different ways you can use it in a slightly different way to look at other problems. And that's effectively what I'm talking about today. I titled the talk, "The Examined Life, Myself, a Wardley Map," and this is a very clear reference to something that probably a lot of people will have heard of before, but just for the sake of clarity, this is a reference to a quote from Socrates. Socrates spent a lot of his time wandering around the streets of Athens, asking people questions and getting people to question themselves. His style themselves, I think, is a bit of a gadfly of the Athenian elite. Possibly the sort of first written or sort of historical record of a pedant. He actually ended up going on trial for this questioning, he was charged with corrupting the youth and not acknowledging the gods, and he was found guilty. Part of his defense during this trial was that he said that an unexamined life is not worth living. He was suggesting that if you don't have the ability to question yourself and guide yourself with questions, then really, you're kind of going through life with the blinkers on. This was seen as a bit of an argument against faith, I guess, and he was found guilty and executed. But I think his basic point was, pretty good. If you don't cast a, not necessarily a critical eye, but if you don't think deeply about the things you're doing, if you don't think about your why and find meaning for yourself, then there's a lot of life that you're potentially going to miss out on. The two sort of key ideas really that I want to share in this talk, and the first is that we can think about mapping techniques, but apply them to ourselves, kind of break ourselves apart a little bit, and that there's some value in that, and there's some meaning that we can get from doing that. And the other one, and it's kind of related, typically when we're Wardley mapping, we are talking about needs. We talk about relationships between components where one thing has a dependency on the other, and that creates a motivation. But actually, there's another set of motivations, particularly when we're thinking about ourselves as individuals. Our fears and the things that we don't want to do are equally motivating. So I'm going to try and talk about that a little bit as well. Before I get to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about failure and some stuff where I tried to apply mapping and it hadn't worked. And one example of this was trying to map teams. I had some lovely theories at one stage. I couldn't quite get it to work, but my theory was, if you had a group of people, you've got different sets of skills, and you need those skills in the organization in a different mix or at different levels of competency, then maybe a map would be a good way of kind of displaying that. We can relate the needs of the organization and maybe the technologies in use. And I'm a techie, so I've used kind of web infrastructure here to the people in the organization and the skills and attributes that they bring. And my hope was that by doing this, it might be interesting to kind of visualize that. Are there gaps that are going to appear? Is it going to be clear that a technology is particularly important in the organization? So in this map that I've got in front of you, I've got this developer, Jill. She's the only one in the two people here who knows C# and knows about AWS, and so there's a dependency on Jill to be able to get some levels of work. And she also has better knowledge of CSS than James does. So there's certain tasks that only Jill can do. If you're hiring, maybe you want to be able to visualize things and kind of write this out. I felt like I didn't make very much progress in this direction. I felt that when I was trying to map other people, I was making statements about my beliefs about those other people and kind of observing them from the outside. And particularly in a team context like this, where I was trying to get at knowledge, understanding, skills, attributes, all that kind of thing. It wasn't really telling me anything that I didn't already know. So I kind of considered that a failure. But it kept kind of coming back to me. I'm going to give you a bit of a warning at this point. I'm going to talk about some psychological ideas. I'm not a psychologist. I don't claim to be one. And I definitely don't want this to come across as a set of tools that might be useful in general psychology and things. I'm merely looking at this from the purpose of self-improvement and from a perspective of kind of general happiness and things, not trying to resolve issues. So lots of people practice journaling, and journaling has a good reputation for improving people's reflectiveness, getting them to think about themselves, introspect a bit more. And the benefit of greater self-reflection should be that you improve your self-awareness. And I mentioned earlier, I do see this balance between self-awareness and situational awareness. There's the external landscape that we've understood, but then there's kind of an internal landscape that we're trying to map out as well. There are downsides to doing this, and particularly in a lot of the psychological literature. The basic point, I think, is that if you don't feel good about yourself right now, spending more time thinking about yourself doesn't necessarily make you feel better. It may make you feel worse. And a lot of the practices that people talk about kind of beyond journaling and things are practices where you set yourself apart and you think about yourself from a kind of third person perspective. In particular, people might talk about using third person language. Alex doesn't like using third person language about himself. It feels a bit strange. And I think it's the same for other people. But what it got me to thinking about was, what if mapping could be that way of getting that perspective, getting that sort of third person shift without talking about myself in a strange way. When we talk about mapping, obviously we talk about needs and we talk about kind of Maslow's hierarchy, and that's one way of kind of categorizing needs. There's a lot of disagreements about whether or not this is the right framework and whether or not it's a good way of thinking about things. I think from the perspective of an individual, it's probably not quite the right thing. And I actually prefer this framework, boiling it down to a couple of simple questions that don't necessarily have a hierarchy, but do allow me to find things that are meaningful to me. Thinking about my safety. Am I feeling loved? Am I feeling enough? And, do I matter? These are things that you can map onto Maslow's hierarchy. But they're not saying that one thing is more important than the other, and I should, map things in that way. So this got me to thinking about, if you've got this set of components that you're thinking about, how do you break them apart? How do you map them? And we hopefully know a Wardley map. We've got a kind of value or visibility access usually, and then an evolution or a sort of commodity access. Not the right way to think about an individual, but there's some very related concepts there. If I think about value, I think about, okay, what are the things I value? Or maybe what's better, where do I spend my time? What are the things that I'm focusing on? What's at the top of my mind? Maybe, this view of a map, all of the things that I should be thinking about or am thinking about and I'm practice thinking about are at the top of this, and the stuff down below is stuff that doesn't come to mind very often. And then equally, when we talk about that kind of horizontal chart, maybe this is about the level of practice and skill I have, or about the habituation, how much benefit that I get from somebody. Is this a positive thing in my life or a negative thing? So just giving a couple of examples here, yoga practice. If you start yoga, you're not very good, you're not very well balanced, you may not be strong enough or flexible enough to do the things that is asked of you. So you can start thinking about some of these different aspects of yourself, your body, your physiology, your mindset, things, and break it apart. And then think about, okay, where am I actually trying to get these to? Have I started yoga for the purpose of doing yoga? Probably not. There's some maybe health benefits, or maybe it's part of a meditative practice. Maybe there's a specific problem I have in one part of my body that I'm looking to strengthen and help resolve. Equally, I can talk about relationships. So again, with these axes, if I'm spending time with people, and they might be higher up the vertical axis, if they're more meaningful to me, maybe they're further along the horizontal axis. And people naturally group into these areas. And even without labeling the relationship map that I've got on the right-hand side, top left-hand corner, people I spend a lot of time with, but not necessarily meaningful. Well, that's clearly work, isn't it? And then on the right-hand side, very meaningful, not as much time as work. That's probably family. And then there's other people in the middle. Do I want those people in those locations? Do I want to be spending less time at work or less time in physical contact with people? Maybe, I work remotely a little bit more. Maybe I want to spend more time in physical contact with people who are not necessarily my immediate family, but still have meaning to me and things. And there's some useful ways of breaking that down. If I'm moving into management as a sort of individual contributor, all of the things that I'm doing at work are going to change. So, I may still be trying to do knowledge transfers, may still be trying to give information I know about products and services in a business and an organization to other people. But the way in which I'm going to do that is going to change. And certainly the other activities that I do, probably not going to code as much in the future. I might, still play around with examples and things like that, but I'm going to spend an awful lot of time in communication with people. I'm going to spend more time one-to-one. I'm spending more time. It's more important to me. All of these things are beginning to shift around. I also wanted to talk about fear very, very quickly. I term these Wardley Vader maps. Whenever I think about fear, Darth Vader is the first person to come to mind. You use them in a traditional map, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But I think it's really interesting when we talk about, why am I as a person, why am I individually trying to do certain things? Why am I not doing certain things? Sometimes there are things I need to do and I just don't want to do them. And, I might be sort of paralyzed by indecision, or demotivated to take something on. In a traditional context, if I'm turning a deployment from a manual process to an automated CI/CD process. There's a couple of reasons why that might not go very well. There may be inertia. Developers don't like giving up control, and that's a fear of theirs. If I don't have control of something, I'm not going to be as easily able to fix it if it goes wrong. That's kind of understandable, and sometimes useful to link, I think, the inertia on a map to a fear that is driving that inertia. But the fear actually may also be a kind of standalone thing. So developers may be fearful of using a new CI/CD process because it's very complex. They don't really understand how it works. They don't feel like that's a skill set that they have. And rationally, people do want to stick with the things that they know. In an interpersonal example, I am effectively a self-employed person, so I spend a lot of time working on my business network and trying to meet people, influence them and things. If I want to do business networking, I need events to go to like this, and to talk to people. I also need to develop rapport with people, and for me personally, there's an inertia there. This was one of the things I started trying to dig into, is understanding, okay, if I think about myself, why is there that inertia there? Well, there's a couple of fears. One fear is meeting new people. Tough for me, tough for other people. Some people are happier doing that than others. Actually, there was another thing that I thought about, which was, okay, if I'm developing rapport with people, I can go and talk to people and try and make conversation things. But I also want people to approach me. And for people to approach me, you need to be approachable. And one of the reasons I figured out I wasn't approachable was because I didn't smile very often. And that was kind of an interesting development for me to think through, because I'm a big guy, I'm over 6 foot. I might be sort of physically intimidating for other reasons, but if you're approachable and you're smiling and you're friendly, physicality doesn't matter so much. I worked out one of the reasons I didn't like smiling was I didn't actually like my teeth. So I went and had my canines straightened to try and get rid of that very personal fear of showing my teeth to people and trying to be friendly. So there we go. That was a little bit longer than I was going to go. But in summary, I think reflective mapping can be very useful. I've given you a couple of ideas there about how I try to do it. I think trying to map fears is really useful as well when we think about what motivates and drives people in organizations. And I'd love to hear from other people about how you map teams and how you map knowledge and understanding in an organization. It hasn't worked for me. I'd love to know who it has worked for. Thanks very much.
So good, Alex. Thank you. That was really thought-provoking. Mike, I want to come first to you because I did ask you the question. Do you think you could now, with that introduction, start making a stab at mapping the impact of your dyslexia?
I think so. Yeah, definitely. It's it might not move. That's one of the things. I map something like poor memory, but like I can't move that to better. So there is it will be interesting, unlike other skills. But yeah, it's really useful.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
Really useful. And so what are some things I'm trying to map that are kind of unusual? One is a negotiation. There's a session on this later. We were talking about this a year ago. How can you map the components that are important to you in a negotiation and understand why they're important, and perhaps the ones that you think are important but aren't? The other one is offering people career advice. I get involved in a lot of this, particularly around tech with early graduates, early learners. And one of the challenges is it's the dots, the pathway, mapping things according to how attainable a specific skill is. It might be that the thing that will have the best career impact will be for you to learn X, but if it probably takes you 10 years versus 2 years for other people, you might want to factor that in your sort of career advice. So really super stuff. Any other thoughts? Karl, what did you think?
I remember kind of going back to maybe the question to Mike. My thought there was, I guess, thinking about Mike's responses, you probably not going to shift dyslexia, but I like that idea of understanding what does having dyslexia, what does that need? And then does that help you figure out, which is similar to what Alex was talking about in terms of approachability. I was like nodding my head and smiling and thinking about you're in my head at the moment. I just, that kind of got me thinking around. Yeah, actually, I don't smile very often, and that probably means I'm not very approachable. So yeah, there's some things at the top you're not going to be able to move, but as you move down, there may be things that you can move and work on there, which are going to support your, the fixed thing higher up.
I think it can be really crucial to identify those things that may or may not be movable. And, there are things that we have to accept about ourselves and, have to love ourselves for who we are. And then there are other things where we maybe do accept ourselves, but still want to improve or change something about us. There may be things that, you can't change, but actually if you alter the landscape around it, then maybe the impact of that or the negative impacts of that are lessened. So I don't have any experience with dyslexia, but so for me, I do know that one of the things I'm not going to get over is my fear of heights, and that just is, a thing that has held me back. And there's different reasons that might hold me back. Playing with children, if I want to go and take my children somewhere and I'm afraid of heights, that might hold me back. And so there are certain things that I then would want to push through, but then I can always get somebody else to go and take them on the Go 8 trail, so they get that experience without having to try and push through something which is quite difficult for me. And there's never a perfect answer for all of these things, but I think actually just getting that clarity about what you think about yourself for now, and it changes over time anyway, can just be really valuable.
I think to Alex's point just about journaling, something I used to do earlier when I thought I had the time. It's only now I look back and I think about how my memory is always just snapshots. Doing this iteratively, if you said I'm just going to practice doing this once a month, I think like all mapping, the process of doing it sort of bounds and constraints and special time when you're actually considering something. So I think this potentially could be either a prompt or a way of journaling. Ultimately, if it was just something that you did as a regular activity in order to develop something. I was interested in that idea that we're not linear, right? So for me, if I was mapping myself, it would actually be most useful not to know that, hey, I behave like this at a particular state in time. It would be tracking a particular quality or component, seeing how that changes over time, and particularly what are the triggers. So it might just be aspects like motivation. It might just be like positivity and mood, but actually measuring that, because we know there's a duality to us, and perhaps there's a valuable understanding in just those patterns of change, where you go through them, what actual things happen from day to day that will cause you not to do something. Go on, Mike.
Yeah, the obvious things for mapping is that there are choices. Your behavior, you have a choice. You have inertia for change, which is mappable. And you have things that come along that don't want you to change. So the rest of the mapping tools also fit here, which is, I would have liked someone to have mapped my career and my skills, pointed out how they were moving to the right very quickly. And it would have given me options.
Well, I actually had somebody go and do an online test and come back and say, hey, this is the career that I think I should do. And it just reminded me of those things we used to do at school, where you'd literally spit up that you should be a plumber, a creative director, and also a mathematician. I think it would be much more useful for people to go through something like this, even if it took them longer. I'm just going to read some of the comments. There's some really interesting comments in the chat. John Shearer, this is to Alex. I like your exploration of skills mapping, the skills matrix. I've tried some of this also, and had people in my team add skills and capabilities for themselves. And considering that in professional growth, that seems to fit with what you go on to discuss about self-reflection. So more of a comment than a question there. Mike, I imagine you can also work out what people value from their ideal map. And now that's a huge one, because I can't remember which research group I stumbled into. I think it was government, and we started talking about the patterns of revolution, right? So we're talking about the Tea Party movement. We're talking about GameStop. and looking at what the sort of commonalities were there. So there's a really interesting thing about mapping oneself in broader society. Alex, this is from Gertie. This is really interesting. In my context, we use LearnLand Karten, learning maps, and I think your thoughts can enrich my work. Chris Dankwa says Mike got his maths physics degree, which is more than I ever did, and something did move, you know, in that you achieved something, so you attained something, so there was some movement there. I suppose you could say knowledge, you could say, you know, confidence. There's probably a number of things related to that would move. Chris also says, I'd love to learn more about the strategies used as it overlaps with the coaching teaching. So I have to do at work. If you have any thoughts on that, go ahead, Mike. And one last comment to read. Claire Dillon, I'd love to see patterns of evolution in certain things where people are mapping themselves, more gameplay, but personal. This is where I was getting at, where somebody tells you, you know what, your skill set is not the thing you do, but there's something really specific that you are unique at, and perhaps you should throw all your chips on that. Even for things like poor memory, maybe others have found services, practices that can help. I could do with some help there too. So anyone on the panel to those 2 points, how do I summarize those? Yeah, additional services, practices that can help, and Mike, specifically to you, yeah, any coaching specific strategies that you think about?
Well, I'll be in the chat, but you can literally use my talk on me. You know what I did, ask me what I saw and how I worked out what to do. Then you'll find out what I know.
Cool. And someone recommend.
I really like.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to recommend a book, Michael Hyatt's Living Forward book, a great way to map yourself. I'm going to check that out. That's from Chris Arnold. Sorry, I interrupted somebody.
I was just going to say I really like the question about sort of gameplay strategies, and I think there's a in terms of individual sort of maps and things, there's a bunch of different things that we can do. One of the things that I think is most powerful, and it goes back to this thing about sort of daily routine and things, there's a Tiny Habits book, and I think the author is Dr. Fogg, but it's a very straightforward way of acquiring and habituating things that you can't do, and partly to get through things like procrastination, as well as you know, trying to support something that you don't feel necessarily good at already, and just opening yourself to different ways of moving things around the map, I think, is really important. One of the things that I discovered, and going back to this point about smiling, there's a relationship between our mental state and our physical and our physiological state, and they influence each other bi-directionally. So obviously, the happier the thoughts you have, and the better you feel, the more that reflects in your body, the more you smile, and all the rest of it. But actually, if you hold yourself up, you breathe in deeper, and you force yourself to smile, or you listen to comedy and you go through that physical process, that also raises your mental state. And there are lots of different things that we can play around with here that allow us to move things, maybe not to where we would want them to be, but in lots of interesting different ways. And I think the opportunity for gameplay is very, very broad.
Yeah, look, we're at time. We're actually a little bit over, but seeing as we started a few minutes late, I thought it was worthwhile, and we just had so many questions and interesting things to discuss. So thank you all for that. I hope that this Ignite session did do that, ignite some thoughts, and hopefully we'll see some people mapping themselves, their domain, basically off the back of what they've heard today. So you've got some other sessions, I think in half an hour or so. I've actually got a lovely break where I'll actually get to join and see a session today. Really thanks to all our speakers. Take a quick moment to just snapshot names in case you do want to sort of follow up with anybody who's spoken today, or in fact anyone who's asked a question. But thanks again to everyone for this session.
Thank you very much, Damien.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you.